You know, my name is Donald. And whenever anyone asks for my name, I always say Donald E. Zimmer. It's just, I guess it's a military custom or what habit. But I'm really Don. So if we could go with that. So I do want to talk to you a little bit today about governance. Uh, Governance? Yeah. Uh, I have a dream about governance, and what I'm going to be asking you today is a series of things that maybe will invite you to look at it perhaps a little bit differently, because I do have a dream. And I do have a dream about doing things a little differently than what I have experienced them in some 40 years of sitting on boards back and forth across the country. It's a dream that's rooted in a conviction of wholeness and a sense of listening to one another. We can and do talk a lot about changes in the church, don't we? We talk about changes in programs, we talk about changes in this, changes in that, but I don't hear a whole lot of conversation that gets back to the heart of governance. And yet, Luke Timothy Johnson talks about that governance may be the best statement that we have, or the clearest statement that we have of our theology and identity. And then Dan Hotchkiss, a writer for Auburn, talks about the decline in our Protestant denominations may have as much to do with the way in which we govern ourselves as anything else. So I think there's an invitation in there to get back and to maybe go down, try to get below the surface of what we do, some of the assumptions that we make and so forth. Did I skip one here? It looks like maybe I might have. The perceptions and potential that we have, I'm going to focus on imagination, and the perceptions and potentials that come out of our imagination are really what drives us. This is what imagination's all about. Instead, not much happens without a dream, not much happens without the ability to imagine. Walter Bergman first got my attention as he began to talk about the different kinds of imaginations that we have. And as you're familiar with that, perhaps you recognize that the two words that I'm using here. He says that we all have this either a royal imagination, a prophetic imagination. And this is in an Old Testament context. So he's saying that the royal imagination is the imagination that comes to us within the institution, the things that we think about and that we do, because our role is really to preserve and to grow the institution. The prophetic imagination, on the other hand, is the imagination from the outsider, the person who's not in the flow of things, doesn't have a say in how things are going. Those two imaginations, I think, just being able to identify them are very important. But I want to add in here another item too, the economic myth. This is a myth that we have in our society, that it's all about growing, it's all about more, it's all about better, it's all about faster. If you watch any of the AT&T commercials, you get the message as the little kids are sitting around the table, and what's it all about? We are very subtly, and oftentimes not so subtly, shaped by this economic myth. These two things combined, I would submit to you, have a very profound and often very subtle influence on how we think, how we govern. We govern out of these perspectives. These are perspectives that come from the organizations that we're a part of. I'd like to add one more thing in here now. In addition to the imaginations and that we have, this prophetic and royal imagination, or the perspective that we have, a second thing is how we think. One of the opportunities that I had in my long career was to have the responsibility for a leadership program for Lutherans, both LCMS and ELCA. As a part of that, I was involved in doing some work in understanding how people think. That was a very, very illuminating experience, because what I found as I was going through all of that was that the people who were clergy, the people who were educators, the people who were lay leaders, and perhaps not so unexpected in the last, they all thought like the business community that I had been a part of and had been talking about and had been doing the same kind of exploration of thinking in the process there too. So we had a mindset. So I've got a mindset, I've got an economic myth, I've got an imagination. The things that we come equipped with, those of us who are part of the organization. And it happened one day. I'd been to Baltimore. And the subject of what was going on in Baltimore was I was talking to some inner city child care providers about this same thing, about how we think, how we see the world. And as I was driving home from Baltimore, I suddenly became aware those folks don't think like I do. There's something fundamentally different in the way in which they're thinking. Their perspective of this world that I think I know so much about is altogether different in so many ways from what they have, or what I have. That was an epiphany to me, because I began to realize then that this same thinking that we have here that is shaped in this way is doesn't just shape our governance, but it also shapes our theology, it shapes our practice, it shapes every bit about our community, and we just kind of take it for granted. Maybe what we need to do is we need to step back and we need to think in some different ways. But how do we think in different ways? Because the people who are a part, I want to skip beyond this, the people who are a part of us, so many of them aren't represented in our governing bodies. Their voices aren't there. Now, I have this picture here of the great Bob Hayes, a world-class sprinter, I think the only Olympic gold medalist and NFL Hall of Famer. These are the things that, if you look at his body, look at every piece that is functioning in there. There is nothing that is missing. Every piece. And for me, that became an overriding metaphor of what I should be searching for in the church. That same kind of thing. That's what we needed to be able to do, was to be able to integrate that body in such a way that we could get something like that. Well, along the way, I also became involved in contemplative Christianity, or contemplative Christian practices, particularly from the historic church. And I began to wonder, why have I not been exposed to these as a person who has been in Lutheran leadership for years and years and years? Why have I not heard this? It came to mind one time when my curriculum committee said, well, we need to have a program, we need to have a part of our curriculum on spirituality. And I said, well, what is that? And they said, well, we don't know. And I said, well, who do I go to talk to? And they said, well, we don't know that either. So somewhere in there, I ran across Eugene Peterson, and he was up at Belair at that in north of Baltimore at that time, and he said, there are three things that define a pastor. One is prayer, one is the participation in the Word, and the third is spiritual direction. And I thought, well, if this is so critical for clergy, why have I not heard about this? And so I did the next best thing then. I went to become a spiritual director. And becoming a spiritual director led me into a different perspective on life. And that led me to an association with an organization called Worshipful Work, whose goal was to integrate spirituality and best business practices and administration into one whole. I was with that organization for a number of years. After about 10 years, we decided that it was time then to hand that ministry off to another organization. I was given the opportunity at that point in time to tell the story of that. So what I wound up doing then was having to sitting with 111 different folks from around the country, from 21 different denominations in something like 26 different states, and asking them, what has been your experience as you have sought to go through this process of integrating traditional Christian spiritual practices, discernment, prayer, these kinds of things that are typically associated with a different pace of life into your church governing and administration? It's a very interesting responses that I got. Responses that touched in some really deep emotional veins as they talked about the issues that they had encountered in trying to change church governance, trying to introduce into governance such basic things as discernment and prayer and silence, other things like that that are so much a part of that contemplative Christian tradition. And they began to speak with an emotion about the opposition that they had encountered. And they began to speak with an emotion about how deeply they felt about it. This was a whole culture within the Christian church across denomination that it just exists like a whole series of pinpoints all across the country, across different denominations, men, women, wherever. And it was something I had just never been aware of. And so I began to ask myself some questions then about what the difference might be if we tried to go ahead and tried to integrate traditional Christian values. I shouldn't say Christian values, but contemplative Christian practices into governance. What I'd like to do perhaps the main part of all of this is to ask you then I would like to ask you some questions. Fundamentally, we can't get to a new place following the pathways that we've been through. Many of us, when we begin talking about something new, then we tell us how to do it. And how can we do it in such a way that we can do it really quick, and it's not going to cost us very much money, and oh, by the way, I won't have to change really as I'm going through this process. Robert Greenleaf tells a story about a boy who is riding through the woods, and he's riding very fast, and it's a very dark woods, and he needs a map, and he's attempting to follow the map and getting through there. And the question is, the map blows away from him. And so what can he do then? And out ahead of him appears a person who has a map and a tray of seedlings. And the question is then, which would you take? The tray of seedlings or the map? I'll offer you a tray of seedlings today. And I'd like to offer it to you in a form of a series of questions. What if we shifted our focus today and began to try to reimagine how we govern ourselves? What if listening and learning together were the most valued parts of our governing life? What if we envisioned our meetings as worship services wherein we conduct business? What if the long-term importance of something became our top priority rather than the tyranny of the immediate administration and management that we so often find ourselves embroiled in? What if we defined our ministries not by communities and programs, but by where people are and by what they are involved in? What if we expanded the thinking present in our governing boards to be more representative of the people of the world in which we live? What if we expanded the focus of our governing conversations to be less on the church and into society, less of the organization and its structures, and more into life, and less in human-centered activity and more into creation-centered activity? What if we recognize that the most of the work that we need to do in board meetings has little to do with committees, finances, worship, properties, and so forth? What if we sought not to attract and involve people to serve on this board or that committee, but to enlist, to enable, to equip, and to empower them to be incarnational wherever they are? What if we used a bowl as our organizational metaphor instead of a pyramid? What if Jesus was in fact the operative model for our leadership? What if the body was really our metaphor for the church and we held less tightly to the universal language of organization? What if we viewed institutional life as a spiritual journey? What if our listening and learning about board life was centered in biblical theological reflection, in story sharing, and in discernment together? What if we set aside the economic measures that so dominate our lives now and ask questions? Have we been a good memory in someone's life? Have our ears and hearts been open to the voice of God? What do we know but live as though we don't know? What if we created meetings that didn't have a parliamentarian, didn't have the procedure that we're so adjusted to in Robert's rules? But what if we had a spiritual guide, a keeper of the flame, a host, a liturgist, persons who were skilled in discernment rather than in parliamentary procedure? What if we were able to detach ourselves from success and to encourage experiment, to fail, and to let die? What if hope and inquiry transcended fear and conformity? What if the right way isn't? What if we valued seedlings more than map? What if we simply could keep from wanting to institutionalize everything? What if people within and outside the church could actually look to church governance as a way of doing business? What if we saw the corporate world as a world that was redeemable also? What if we had artists and poets and musicians and their voices as a part of our governance? How might we be different? And I'm sure you can answer a ton of what ifs too. And the point is, can we be able to step back in our governing board that's the foundation for all of our churches? Can we step back and can we ask a different question? One day after I had finished talking about this before a bunch of UCC clergy out in Illinois, one of them came up to me and he said, how do we have the opportunity, or how can we devote time to prayer? We don't even have the time to do business. Something missing there, isn't there? A perspective that perhaps we need to change. And so what I want to do today is I want to leave you with a series of what if questions and invite you to continue in that dialogue of asking questions of what if. Thank you.